Hi, I'm James Weinberg, and I'm delighted to be here for this year's PSA Early Career Network Conference, and honored to be giving the keynote address. As someone who chaired the Early Career Network back when it was first starting out in 2015, 2016, I'm delighted to see just how far it's come, especially under the stewardship of the current committee. And I think this conference is a really amazing testament to the diversity of research within our community and to the vibrancy of early career academia, especially in political science and cognate disciplines. So I want to start by saying a massive thank you to everyone who's already presented their research. I look forward to watching more presentations before the conference finishes, and I wish you all well with your ongoing research activities and your future careers. For today's keynote lecture, I'm going to talk about political trust. And to keep it fresh, I'm going to talk about some research that I've been doing in the last year or so with politicians as part of an ongoing study of trust and governance in the UK and beyond, funded by the Leverhulme Trust. And I'm going to think about four broad questions, and I'll pick these apart more as I go on. But roughly, I'm going to be thinking about what do the concepts of trust and distrust mean? So what do we mean when we use these? But more specifically, what might it mean to study these terms dialogically? And by that, I mean from the perspective of politicians. So, what's the importance of the extent to which politicians feel trusted or distrusted? And can that felt trust and distrust impact their decision making? And given the links between trust and other concepts like risk, might that relationship differ in varying scenarios of risk presentation and appraisal? But I'm also going to think towards the end of the lecture about another question related to how politicians live their lives and govern in an age of distrust. And that is the extent to which distrust might be a stressor on politicians' health and well-being in political office. And going to take some time to think about why that might be an important research topic and an important question to ask, not only from the perspective of those in political office, but from the rest of us who are being governed by them. So let's start with this picture then. And I've included this because I think one of my favorite remarks on the topic of trust is an apocryphal quote that was attributed to Joseph Stalin, who apparently said to Nikita Khrushchev, "I'm finished. I trust no one, not even myself." And true or not, I think that this quote captures the dark end of a truism that most social scientists know intuitively. In fact, most people know intuitively, and that is that trust is vital. It's important for all forms of human social interaction. And that becomes particularly pertinent in politics. And in political science, we know that variants of the trust concept have been studied as integral preconditions for good governance and democratic health. We've got some scholars who are kind of grounded in a trust as evaluation tradition, who study the causes and consequences of citizens' trust as a basis of evaluations of the economy and various policy outcomes. And we've got other scholars who look at citizens' trust in specific political actors, organizations, institutions, studies of trustworthiness. But on both sides of this kind of scholarly divide or this endeavor, we've found strong positive associations between trust and outcomes as wide-ranging as public attitudes, participation, legal compliance, policy responsiveness, legitimacy, long-term institutional stability. The list goes on. And where distrust has been studied as a focal point of research, it does appear to push people to opt out of traditional politics and calls into question the longevity or even legitimacy of long-held democratic norms. So to say that political trust matters might be somewhat of an understatement. And maybe this opening gambit is simply preaching to the converted already. But it's because of this strong evidence base about the importance of trust and distrust that political scientists and practitioners alike have been so worried by downward trends in trust and upward trends in distrust. Over a period of more than 60 years, just to take a few examples, the Pew Research Center and the American National Election Study repeatedly asked US citizens how much they trust the government in Washington to do the right thing. And in 1958, we were looking at a figure of about 73% of Americans who said they could trust the government just about always or most of the time. By 1990, this figure was at 35%. In the middle of 2019, it was down to 17%, with just 3% saying they trusted the government to do what was right just about always. No different here in Britain to many extents. Between 1944 and 72, the proportion of British citizens who viewed politicians as self-seeking rose marginally from about 35% to 38%, whilst the proportion who thought politicians were out to do the best for their country dropped from about 36 to 28. But then between 1972 and the mid kind of 2010s, the first of these metrics rose to 48%, and the latter dropped to just 10%. So by 2019, we've got a Hansard Society report, or a Hansard Society audit rather, concluding that opinions of the systems of governing in the UK are at their lowest point in a 15-year audit series. And we can see similarly worrying metrics in a range of not only well-established liberal democracies, but also kind of third wave and emerging or new democratic states. One example being South Africa. Between 2006 and 2015, Afrobarometer surveys kind of document this drop of about 13 percentage points in political trust in the parliament and president in South Africa. And these kind of declining or stable low levels of political trust have been linked to other worrying features of democratic deconsolidation in states like South Africa. It's also worth noting, and I'm sure many of you saw this in the news over the last year or so, that the kind of the rally round the flag effect that was well discussed at the start of the pandemic has now dissipated. We are back to business as usual, so to speak, in regards to trust. And just some figures here from the Edelman Barometer showing the extent to which trust rose and then decreased again drastically between the start of the pandemic in April, May last year to the start of this year. Now, that's a kind of broad context to what we're discussing today in this lecture. But for me, there's a missing piece in this puzzle. Because despite the existence of such a kind of voluminous and expanding literature attesting to the importance of political trust, it's astonishing that so little of it, if any, has actually focused upon how politicians live their lives in situations of extreme and generalized distrust, let alone how the existence of a low trust, high blame environment affects their decision-making, the quality of public governance. And for me, insofar as what Patty Leonard aptly calls a climate of trust is necessary in a healthy democracy, I think it's crucial that we ask not only whether the public trusts in politicians, but whether politicians accurately perceive and act upon the trust placed in them. And this question is the one that I want to kind of interrogate in this lecture, and the one that I think represents a missing piece in the trust puzzle as studied in political science and other disciplines. Let's pause, however, just to kind of think about trust as a concept, because it's one of those concepts that Walter Bryce Galley would have famously called an essentially contested concept, or people like David Collier and Stephen Levitsky would call a concept with adjectives. It can often be opaque. It can often be used without clear definitions being attributed to it. So before we proceed, I just want to take a minute or two to think about the thornier question of what trust means, at least for me in the context of this lecture. Now, there continues to be a fierce debate about whether citizens draw holistic trust judgments about general political cultures, or whether trust is more multi-level, multi-dimensional, malleable. The former of those interpretations has tended to dominate a relatively traditional and long-standing approach to the measurement of trust in global surveys, such as the American National Election Survey, General Social Survey, Gallup, And the latter has kind of become more dominant in the organizational and psychological sciences. Now, for me, I distinguish here between trust as an action, or in my own research, I like to distinguish between trust as an action, which might be decisions or behaviors, and trust as a concept. So a series of what I'm calling internalized psychological processes that then inform those actions. And this approach relies on a number of core assumptions that I'll share with you now. So firstly, that trust in all forms is relational. It depends upon reciprocal, multifaceted judgments about trustor and trustee. And thirdly, it's interrelated to but distinguishable from distrust. Now, on the first point, scholars like Peter Nanstead and Russell Hardin have advanced quite a sound understanding of trust as a three-way relationship, where A trusts B, or some specific B rather, with respect to some specific X. And the important takeaway from that is that trust must be conceived and thus analyzed as something that is granted contingently within a context-specific domain of action. On the second point, the contingencies that are implicit in this relational model are resolved by trust judgments about the trustworthiness of another person or institution even. So to be precise, people make cognitive, affective or emotional, and even behavioral intentional judgments about possible trustees. And that might be related, as Roger Mayer and others have written extensively on, their ability, their benevolence, their integrity. And these trust judgments reflect our prior knowledge or experience about a possible trustee and act as Joe Ham calls them psychological conduits for the behavioral execution of our willingness or a trustor's willingness to accept vulnerability to a trustee. And finally, trust and distrust are occupying these independent yet parallel dimensions. So we've got to think about trust on one hand as something that allows for the possibility of harm. It facilitates cooperative behaviors, whilst distrust on the other invokes an expectation of harm or betrayal and elicits very different actions to manage risk. So what I'm saying is we're taking that understanding of trust, but we're going to, or I'm rather going to kind of flip it to think about it dialogically. And what does that mean? So for me, by focusing on politicians as the object of study, I think we can take quite a novel approach to vertical trust-based relationships, specifically in politics, that acknowledges the relevance of elites' felt trust and distrust. And so we can take the normative arguments or logics of trust and recast them dialogically. So we might argue that political trust and distrust fluctuate as part of a perpetual dyad in which politicians' actions affect public responses and vice versa. And politicians' perceptions or feelings of being trusted or distrusted might then operate as the mediating lens through which a distrust or trust-based claim and response model of governor-governed relations elicits appropriate or even proportionate reactions. And this takes us beyond existing studies of trust in politics that tend to elide some of this gritty and complex humanity that I think sits as a black box between mass public opinion surveys and many of the service outcomes with which they're commonly correlated. So what does that actually mean? I mean, to put it kind of in the terms of the definition of trust I've just given, I'd say that politicians may feel or believe they're trusted by some specific audience to carry out or decide upon some specific piece of legislation. And that would be an example of relational perceptions of trust. Politicians may believe or feel or assume that their constituents or voters, the broader public, sees them as competent, honest, loyal, or conversely, believes or feels that they're seen as self-interested, incapable, even indifferent. And these would be other to self trust judgments. And this leads to a kind of bigger question. Well, specifically, whether or not these feelings, beliefs, or perceptions of being trusted or distrusted can actually impact politicians' decisions and behaviors. And here we can make a number of propositions. The first is to do with trust and risk. Now, risk is, of course, endemic to political life. By virtue of holding office, politicians must constantly make decisions with very real, very consequential, personal, political, public risks attached to them. But these risks are interwoven with the psychological fabric of trust and distrust, which are, in essence, a kind of evolutionary response to our ontological vulnerability in any situation. So in the face of risk and uncertainty, we're always making judgments about the trustworthiness of those managing the risk that we face, or possible allies that might help us navigate a risky situation. But we failed to consider how this works in reverse. So, do politicians' perceptions of public trust or distrust impact their propensity to engage in risk-seeking or risk-averse behaviors? And that leads to proposition 2. So how do we link this more precisely? And here I draw on the trust as heuristic tradition, thinking about the work of people like Thomas Rudolph and Mark Hetherington. And from this perspective, political trust acts as a heuristic or a decision rule that assists in existing literature, assists citizens as they decide whether or not to support government action. And other things being equal, if people perceive the architect of policies as untrustworthy, they'll reject policies. If they consider them trustworthy, they're more inclined to embrace them. And scholars working in this tradition are very kind of determined in the statement that the trust heuristic is activated under conditions of risk. So for the public, that's uncertainty about the outcomes of a policy, the possibility that those outcomes might be desirable or undesirable. But what we can do is flip this logic 180 degrees to suggest that fluid and variegated perceptions of public trust and distrust might also act as a heuristic for politicians who not only occupy this job that's laden with risk, but exist in an overwhelmingly complex information environment. And in this respect, I kind of suggest that politicians, they're normal mortals, just like the rest of us, who draw on cognitive and affective shortcuts, but are doing so in extraordinary circumstances. And as with studies of the public, therefore, I suggest that this trust heuristic, but understood dialogically, may help to explain how and why politicians navigate risky decisions in public office. So we might expect, in line with the trust heuristic literature, that politicians who feel or believe they are trusted will be more likely to underweight the personal or public risks attached to occupational choices, and those who feel or believe they're distrusted might be more likely to overweight those risks. And this is, I kind of surmise that this is because perceptions of trust or distrust are likely to facilitate or mitigate risky decisions respectively by providing a bellwether of the broader kind of social and political firmament, the broader social political consensus, but also providing a blueprint of anticipated reactions. So let's consider how this might play out then in the context of the COVID-19 crisis. To the extent that political leaders were quickly made aware of epidemiological measures such as social distancing, contact tracing, mass testing that could counter this virus's threat, this crisis it's what Donald Rumsfeld would have called a known unknown. But whether or not that existing intelligence was successfully deployed relied upon confident relations between political leaders and those they governed. And from this perspective, political trust has been key to effective governance during this time of uncertainty. If anything, crises like COVID-19 place an added premium on that social contract that underpins principal and agent relations in democracy, which fundamentally rely on trust judgments by those without power in those with decision-making authority to act in their better interests. But we know very little, despite a number of studies that have come out looking at how much the public have trusted in politicians during this crisis. We know very little about the other side of this coin. Have politicians felt trusted enough to govern effectively? And this is, partly because the literature on trust has tended not to take a dialogic approach to the study of that concept, but also because elites are notoriously difficult to study outside of a crisis, and simply to get access to them, let alone during one. But in the case of COVID, we might assume, in line with this trust heuristic thesis I've just discussed, flipped dialogically, that politicians with high levels of felt trust would be more confident in enforcing or supporting large-scale social and economic lockdowns that, at the very height of the crisis at least, carried unknown consequences in terms of the economic hit, the social hit, the health and political consequences. In many respects, it was a risk to enforce all those lockdown measures. But there are two sides to that debate, as we will see in a minute. So how might we test this? Well, we can test these assumptions with data that I collected from local councillors, locally elected politicians, in the first 10 days of the UK's initial lockdown. Now, although locally elected politicians were not at the forefront of official media briefings about COVID, they weren't involved in voting on the emergency powers granted in Westminster, they were placed at the heart of the coronavirus response. They were tasked with delivering on the high expectations set by national governments in terms of providing networks of support to citizens, to those most vulnerable during the lockdown, as well as enforcing lockdown measures in their localities. And indeed, an OECD report in June last year highlighted the importance of local government in the coronavirus response in a number of different states. So for this reason, local governments, they offer a kind of underdeveloped but also important locale for studies of crisis leadership. So we've got surveys that were fielded to UK politicians on the 2nd of April in 2020, kindly assisted by the Local Government Association. We've got a diverse sample here that I've also weighted to reflect the national population of local politicians. And these politicians completed a 24-item battery of political trust that contained 12 items measuring cognitive judgments about politicians, what people think of them, 6 items measuring affective judgments, what people feel about politicians, and 6 items measuring behavioral intentional judgments, so how people anticipate behaving towards politicians. But in all cases, these items were inverted to represent other to self judgments. So the extent to which local councillors were perceiving public making these judgments about themselves. And various robustness checks, multidimensional scaling, principal component factor analysis was used to check that we had some underlying constructs here. Trust came out very strongly, so did distrust, but also a third construct of mistrust, which is quite interesting. I mean, mistrust has been debated at length as a key resource for critical citizens, central to ideas of political accountability, and 1/3 of what the TrustGov team down in Southampton calls the family of trust concepts. And in contrast to the negativity and cynicism that underpins distrust, mistrust denotes more of a cautious attitude towards others, characterized by that kind of careful and questioning mindset. And it's interesting that in evaluating public judgments of themselves, we find that politicians also appear to distinguish between expressions of distrust and mistrust. And if anyone wants to know more about how that survey is constructed, how those constructs were extracted from it, please get in touch with me. We've got a couple of examples of items on the screen. Anyway, we want to think about how politicians' scores for that survey predict, in this instance, policy support during the COVID crisis. So all of the councillors reported their support, or their agreement rather, with 10 policy approaches to governing through the pandemic, 7 of which, such as covering the wages of those unable to work, the furlough scheme, became official policy announcements. And responses to these 7 items were aggregated into a single policy support score for inferential analysis. So let's see what we found then. Well, among these politicians, policy support was generally quite high, but there were some differences, particularly along partisan fault lines. And these kind of reflect the traditional ideological leanings of the UK's political parties on the left and right. For instance, as shown in the diagram here, Conservative councillors supported higher agreement for financial packages aimed at supporting UK businesses, whereas Labour councillors were much more likely to support the furlough scheme for individuals who'd been unable to work. The differences were particularly stark when we think about the transfer of power to the incumbent Conservative government in Westminster. Over 50% of Conservative councillors strongly agreed with this measure, but fewer than 15% of Labour and Lib Dem councillors did. So we might infer that, amidst these high levels of support for various policies, politicians were not exactly governing with uniform consensus at the local authority level. And what about levels of trust then? Well, what I've done here is I've shown you the average levels of felt trust, distrust, and mistrust among local councillors, as compared to surveys that were fielded simultaneously to members of the public, completing exactly the same questionnaire, but not with the inverted measures. So they were completing each item as if they were judging politicians. And I've broken it down by Labour and Conservative here, just to show that in all instances, councillors' perceived public trust was substantially higher than the public's actual trust in them, and their distrust substantially lower. And the gap between real and perceived trust and distrust, I think, is an interesting finding in and of itself, and we'll come back to that when we move into the second half of this lecture. So we can regress policy support on felt trust, distrust, and mistrust, along with a range of various control variables. But what we find, as I've shown here on the screen, is that feelings of both trust and distrust shared a meaningful relationship with councillors' self-reported policy support at the first peak of the pandemic. And various robustness checks suggest that these are contributing independently of one another as well. Now, these results not only point to the kind of salience of these concepts, the importance of studying trust dialogically, but also point to the asymmetric nature of trust and distrust, i.e. both can be salient in a scenario. Politicians who felt trusted may, as we anticipated, have underweighted the risks of enforcing these strict policy responses, but politicians who felt distrusted may have overweighted the risks of not acting. And this raises the next question for me to explore in this lecture, which is, what are the confounds here? What are the weaknesses in testing these associations directly? And one may be that councillors appraise the risk attached to different policies in scenarios like a pandemic differently, and that the risk attached to acting or not acting may have been presented to them in different ways. So this leads to the next section of this lecture then, about how trust and risk and their relationship to politicians' decision-making are mediated by contextual factors. And the first proposition I want to make here is that politicians don't get their choice of choices. So as a rule, political institutions, both formal and informal, delimit the options that are available to officials in decision-making scenarios. And so when we're thinking about politicians' decisions and their behaviors, we need to consider multiple explanatory mechanisms that account for internal preference formation, heuristic thinking, other psychological variables, as well as the external provision of choice. There are very few, if any, scenarios in which politicians can avoid risk, but more often than not, politicians are choosing between options that are made to seem more or less risky. And the way that those options are presented, I suggest, may heighten or diminish heuristic thinking and the relevance of felt trust and distrust. Now, in psychology, many of you will have come across prospect theory, whether you're studying in psychology or not. But prospect theory describes the way in which we accommodate ourselves to these moments of differential uncertainty. And in particular, a reflection effect is a well-researched behavioral regularity where people try to avoid risk when they're already facing gains, but they embrace risk when they're already facing losses. And that's because probabilities are generally underweighted by humans. The chance of a good outcome often receives too little weight, so a gamble for gains looks less attractive, whereas the probability of a bad outcome is also underweighted, which makes a gamble over losses look more attractive. And there have been some studies of the reflection effect among politicians, two that I'm aware of, one by Enrique Fatas and colleagues in Spain, looking at how 32 expert Spanish politicians fell foul to this heuristic, and another completed by Jonah Linder and Barbara Viz, who studied 40-odd Dutch MPs and again found some evidence of a reflection effect. So, you know, there is already a nascent evidence base out there showing that politicians do engage in these heuristics like the rest of us. But I suggest, as I already intimated, that the trust heuristic will work with rather than against or in place of these logics. So in the case of politicians, we might suggest that feelings or beliefs about being distrusted compound risk avoidance when facing gains. And that's because perceived public distrust might lower self-efficacy, heighten acute awareness of the possible positive political effects of settling for an assured outcome versus the dangers of failure vis-a-vis personal, electoral, or career ramifications. So good outcomes are underweighted even further. Whereas in contrast, feelings or beliefs about being trusted are more likely to reinforce politicians' risk acceptance, especially when facing losses, because there's a reservoir of trust there. There's a heightened self-efficacy that might facilitate bold or risky decisions, and in other words, bad outcomes are underweighted even further. So how do we test this then? Well, in a second wave of data collection back in December and January, I was collecting lots of survey data and interview data from politicians in various countries, including a subsample of MPs in the UK, Canada, and South Africa, who kindly completed survey experiments for me that elicited different presentations of risk, different risk appraisals designed to induce a reflection effect. And they also took the inverted 24-item measure of felt trust and distrust. And interestingly, again, various robustness checks on the data showed that 3 factors emerged from that trust battery that we can identify as trust, mistrust, and distrust, and use those in later analyses. And again, all this data was weighted to reflect the composition of each of these parliaments from which participants were drawn. And we've got 2 kind of Western long-standing liberal democracies with a kind of bicameral Westminster tradition, and then for comparison as well, MPs from South Africa, a kind of newer democracy with a slightly different parliamentary system and a very different political culture, but all 3 countries facing issues of trust. Scores for these MPs showed that kind of MPs in all 3 countries are feeling more trusted than they do distrusted, which is again surprising, as we saw with councillors before, given the parlous state of the public's political trust in each of these nations. And again, suggests that whether politicians are at the local level, at the national level, they're not making accurate appraisals of an otherwise low trust, high distrust civic culture. Slightly interesting, we see that UK MPs feel less trusted and more distrusted than their peers in either Canada or South Africa. And that may say something about the political culture in the UK insofar as MPs and their offices are particularly geared towards developing close relations and links between representatives and constituents across multiple media and face-to-face. So that political contact might actually help to mitigate MPs' misperceptions of public trust and distrust. But it's an interesting, even if negligible, comparative finding for further discussion in future research papers. This was the experiment that I'm going to share with you. They took a number of experiments, but this one's particularly pertinent because we're thinking about the pandemic and moving on from the previous data I showed you collected from councillors. So this is an adapted version of Daniel Kahneman's Asian disease problem, as he called it, which was originally fielded to citizens. And it's been slightly adapted here for MPs. So in the face of a public health emergency, MPs have to vote for one of 2 different response packages. And whilst the probability of mitigating the death toll is the same for each of these packages, the probabilities are presented in terms of gains and losses in different treatment conditions. So as such, the kind of the risks are presented in different ways that might induce a reflection effect. And hey presto, we find that MPs across these 3 different countries were very susceptible to this manipulation. So strong evidence of treatment validity. So where MPs were placed in the loss treatment condition, they were 49% more likely to opt for the risky legislative package in experiment 1. And these effects are pretty large, quite impressive, and put simply, they show that MPs are susceptible to reflection effects in occupational scenarios, especially one that's extraordinary, like voting on a response to a pandemic. But what we're interested in, and this is a table of numbers, so we'll move on quickly. But what we're interested in is the possible relationships between the reflection effect and these treatment conditions, the presentation of risk, and politicians' felt trust and distrust. So what I do here is present a series of OLS models where the dependent variable is a continuous outcome that combines participants' binary decisions with their confidence in that decision, thus getting around some of the limitations of simple binary dependent variables. And our independent variables are a number of controls, as well as interactions between our factor scores for trust, distrust, mistrust, or felt trust, felt distrust, felt mistrust, and our treatment conditions. And where the data are pooled, we're looking at fixed effects and clustered standard errors to account for that within country variation. We can see in some of the other subsample models. But importantly, what we find is these predicted effects of trust perceptions. So in the gain treatment, MPs were more likely to take a risk by voting for the legislative package when they also perceived higher levels of public trust. And that supports the kind of the main effects of trust that we anticipated, or I anticipated earlier in this talk. But MPs who felt more trusted were actually less likely to take the risky choice when it was presented through the loss frame, which is contra to our hypothesis. So in the loss treatment condition, we see a kind of a 1 standard deviation increase in felt trust results in a decrease of about 0.65 standard deviations in the likelihood that the MP takes the risk. The result being that those MPs with the highest levels of felt trust were equally likely to take the risky decision, regardless of whether they were randomly assigned to a gain or a loss treatment condition. So far from emboldening MPs in situations of risk, what we might see here is that feelings of trust, perceptions of public trust, actually inhibit a reflection effect. And it might be that MPs with high levels of felt trust are aware of the political capital they command and how quickly they might squander it. So positive appraisals of public trust judgments lead to cautious decision-making and more circumspection in the calculation of risk, i.e. over rather than underweighting the personal or public risks attached to occupational choices. Faced with unavoidable losses, politicians who feel trusted may be more likely to discount potential gains relative to additional losses that might result from a risky decision. And these are assumptions that we can also find developed in the literature on blame avoidance behavior. For those of you who know it, Kent Weaver famously argued that politicians display a systematic bias towards a minimax strategy to minimize the maximum loss. And that might be what we're seeing played out here in this relationship between trust perceptions and the presentation of risk and politicians' decisions. Now, obviously, these findings are experimental, and as with all experiments, they don't directly replicate the experience of behaving in the real world, especially not the complex and messy subjective realities of being a politician. So what I'm hoping to do in the third wave of research on this topic is to take the observational data and I've got from councillors, this experimental data from MPs, and have a look at some behavioral real world dependent variables and see how those relationships that I presented here replicate. But for now, I'm gonna leave you with this this finding as something to motivate further discussion. And for the final part of the talk, I'm going to come back to the last question I posed at the beginning of this presentation, which was about the micro level of political life. So where felt distrust, accurately perceived or not, and even the futility of attempts to counter it, might negatively impact politicians' mental health and well-being. Now, the World Health Organization describes mental health as a state of well-being in which every individual realizes his or her own potential can cope with the normal stresses of life, can work productively and fruitfully, and is able to make a contribution to his or her community. Now, the pressures exerted on politicians that may threaten their mental health or well-being, as per this definition, are, in my opinion, immense. And in a 9-part theoretical framework of stresses in political work that I published a couple of years ago with colleagues, I point to the potentially destructive impact of working in a low trust, high blame environment. So alongside the other stresses in this framework that I've presented on the screen, distrust is there as a stressor that might be detrimental to politicians' professional competency and their sense of personal worth and well-being. Now, the hallmarks of political distrust as they manifest in politics, such as persistent criticism, fault-finding, reminders of past mistakes, dismissive regard, they're just as likely to manifest in specific illnesses or forms of behavior among politicians as they do, or as they have been found to do, among other professionals such as medics and teachers. And here we're talking about symptoms like anxiety, depression, alcohol, and drug misuse, exhaustion, breakdown, high-risk behavior, poor decision-making. And it's for this reason that it's really important that we consider the extent to which politicians are affected in this way. And some of the work I'm doing at the moment is directed towards filling the gaps, the empirical gaps, empirical blind spots that we have when it comes to exploring this framework of stresses in political life. So let's start with some qualitative exploration of this then. So as part of the study that I've already mentioned, I conducted 51 interviews with politicians from 8 different parliaments, from 4 different continents, back in December, January. This was a diverse sample of participants who were extracted from the broader sample of nationally elected politicians, or just national politicians, some of whom weren't elected, who'd taken part in the survey study. And in in-depth interviews, I asked a question to each of them that was, has your work as an elected politician impacted your mental health or well-being? And if so, how? The transcripts have now been multiple coded, so jointly coded by myself and a couple of other colleagues, for evidence of the 9 stresses I showed you on previous slide. And as presented in this graph, you can see that the organizational, the lifestyle, and the distrust stresses were the most prevalent in the sample population. And this is fascinating for a number of reasons, not least because it shows that that theoretical framework of stresses has relevance for the subjective lived experiences of politicians who hold office. And in turn, these stresses are worryingly prevalent. Politicians are identifying lots of different instances in which they emerge and place pressure on them in their occupational lives. And I'll share just a couple of quotes where politicians expressed instances that typified the distrust stressor at its extremes, where distrust bubbled over into abuse, into hostile cynicism. And there was some national variety in this. We see a very extreme situation in South Africa in the third quote there, and that it wasn't unusual amongst participants from South Africa to give similar stories to that. But we also see evidence of distrust leading not only to abuse and hostility online, but also death threats in most of the countries where these participants were drawn from. And you've got 2 more examples there from New Zealand and the UK. And there were some sub-themes. So online hostility, Twitter and Facebook, politicians were saying, these social media devices have exacerbated the situation. They give unfettered rein to keyboard warriors who wish to vent their distrust in short, sharp, and often anonymous attacks on them, and that was hard to escape. There was a narrative of general harassment and cynicism, something that politicians who were interviewed said had become almost normalized in the public's political culture and the way in which we interact or think of politicians. And then there was another sub-theme about the media, the fact that the press has overly personalized the political and overly politicized the personal, to the extent that they're fueling a culture of distrust in politicians' competence, integrity, benevolence, that goes beyond the traditional accountability function of a democratic press. So politicians then, based on this evidence I'm presenting here, are aware of these stresses, they're feeling them, and at some extremes of this narrative, they're really suffering because of them. Now, based on that interview exploration of distrust as a stressor, I would also expect that we'd find quantitative associations between politicians' perceptions of public distrust and their clinical well-being. So with that in mind, another subset of 146 politicians who participated in my research back in December and January completed the Patient Health Questionnaire, PHQ-9, which is one of the most commonly used tools for screening depression in primary care. It has a sensitivity of about 88% in terms of accurately diagnosing major depression in adults across various occupational groups and various demographic groups. And what I'm kind of hypothesizing here, based on that qualitative exploration, is that feelings of distrust, or being a politician who feels like they're distrusted, will positively correlate with mental ill health, such as depression, as measured by this questionnaire. Here are some kind of cross-sample descriptors for you. So we see some variation in depressive symptoms across countries, with rates slightly higher among UK and South African MPs than either Canadian MPs or, interestingly, unelected politicians in the UK's second chamber. But sample sizes are, we're looking at about 40 in each of these groups, so not big enough to really ascertain whether these cross-country variations are statistically significant. But we see some general trends here. And in the general population, scores of about 0 to 5 indicate mild depression. So as soon as you're scoring on this scale, there are some mild symptoms of depression there, and scores of 6 to 10 indicate moderate symptoms of depression. So we can see that MPs are experiencing symptoms of depression on average. And none of the individuals here are scoring above 10, which is the usual cutoff for major depression. But we might also expect that MPs downplay their own responses to clinical measures for a whole host of reasons. So with that in mind, evidence of these mild to moderate symptoms is still worrying. What we're more interested in, though, is whether these scores vary among politicians based on how trusted or distrusted they feel. And again, I've presented this for you on the screen. So we split the sample of survey participants who took the PHQ-9 at the median of both variables, so felt trust and distrust, to create these two groups of politicians who respectively perceive above and below median levels of trust and distrust. And the graph on the screen then reports the weighted means for the PHQ-9 for those groups, along with some weighted t-tests. And what we see is that, as expected, there's a positive association between feeling distrusted in political office and experiencing higher levels of mental ill health, such as severe conditions like depression, as measured in this particular instance. Now, I've only scraped the tip of the data for the purpose of presenting it in today's lecture, and there's obviously a lot more to do in terms of analyzing this and thinking about it in detail, but these findings are stark, and they reflect the conditions of public office, of life in public office, that are already hinted at by insider commentaries and political biographies. And I think whilst researching these individual level implications of distrust for politicians might not garner much public sympathy or support, this work fills a big gap in running debates about democratic decline and deconsolidation. Because, to be precise, or in my opinion, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on this, the health of democracy, as measured by input, throughput, output metrics of performance, whatever you want, may well depend on the mental health and psychological well-being of those we elect to represent us and take decisions on our behalf, and to do so in high-pressured environments. All right, then. I'm coming to the end of my allotted time, so I want to wrap up this lecture with a few key findings and questions or discussion points for you to take away. So in this talk, I set out to argue that politicians' perceptions or feelings of public trust and distrust impact the kind of claim and response model of representative democracy upon which policy responsiveness and good governance are built. And I suggested that felt trust and felt distrust operate as a heuristic for politicians' decision-making under conditions of risk that are endemic to political life, and that operating in a climate of distrust may well negatively impact the health and well-being of those tasked with running the country. And I hope that the new data that I've presented in today's keynote, as well as some of the theoretical arguments I've made, has shown the merit of these propositions. And I think that these findings and these ideas have important implications for existing and prospective work. So whilst public opinion surveys and polls and other academic work measures political trust or distrust as predictors of political outcomes, and that's all incredibly useful, they do seem to paint an incomplete picture for me. Whereas a dialogic model of trust relations that acknowledges the importance of both the principal, i.e. citizens, the trustors, and agent, i.e. politicians or the trustees, gives us more. So to understand when, why, or how trust does or does not facilitate good governance, or distrust does or does not stimulate change, as political scientists, we should be asking also whether A, politicians' felt trust and distrust are contextually relevant, and to what extent when we're researching any particular contextual question, and B, whether politicians' perceptions of public trust and distrust judgments are accurate, and whether that also is contextually relevant. And on the latter point, some of the data I presented here suggests that actually MPs' perceptions or feelings of being trusted and distrusted are out of step with public opinion. At the same time, I hope that this talk has raised a number of prosaic concerns, prosaic questions. If, for instance, MPs feel more trusted and less distrusted than they actually are, what does that say about the state of contemporary democracy? Was it ever thus? How might such dislocation be corrected? And I think for that, we need concurrent studies of elite and public opinion to dissect those questions. But similarly, if feelings of trust, distrust, and even mistrust, as I've found, are activated in conditions of risk and act as a decision-making heuristic, do we need to pay greater attention to things such as the conditions in which MPs make decisions, the people who present MPs with information and or various policy options, and even how that information is presented to them? And I think given the far-reaching consequences of political decisions and the power that many politicians may wield in the course of their careers, the answer to those questions should be a resounding yes. And moreover, if politicians' well-being is suffering as a consequence of our febrile political climate, what can we do to improve the tenor of governor-governed relations so that the job's not only sustainable, but also attractive to a wider range of aspirants? These are questions that I will leave you all to ponder after this talk. If you want to find out more about any of my work, please get in touch with me. If you're interested in the kind of psychology of politicians and political ambition, political leadership, please take a look at the first book that I published last year on the topic of political ambition, or look out for my current book that's I'm working on, which covers not only everything I presented today, but lots more data on trust, distrust, and politician perceptions thereof. So that leaves me just to say a massive thank you to the ECN committee for inviting me to give this keynote lecture. I hope that everyone watching found it interesting and stimulating, and hopefully has given you some food for thought. And I look forward to hearing from you, either comments on this lecture or with questions about wider research. And I'm sure, as with all PSA trustees, I'm more than happy to be contacted by any early career colleague who wants to ask questions about how to build a career in academia, build a career in political science. And if I can, I will offer help and resource in response to those questions. I wish you all a very good conference and a very pleasant summer when it arrives.